Hello, I'm Edward Glaeser, and I have spent my life studying and loving the world's cities. Cities do many amazing things. They enable the collaborative chains of creativity that have powered humanity since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner, and since Donatello and Brunelleschi toured around Rome to figure out the artistic mysteries of the ancient world. But while there are many amazing things that happen in cities, there are also demons that come with density. High housing costs, traffic congestion, crime, and most terribly of all, contagious disease have all troubled the great cities of the world. Athens itself was brought low by the plague that came to that city in 430 BC and stymied Pericles' goal of beating the Spartans. The plague also killed Pericles himself. In 541 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's dreams of reimposing the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world were brought to an end by the first appearance of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, on European shores. And for the past 700 years, we have continued over and over again to have diseases come and stalk our cities. In a sense, we have lived through a blessed century since the influenza pandemic of 1919, where our cities have remained remarkably safe. But that is not the norm. And in some sense, the return of COVID-19, the coming of COVID-19, returns us back to this older world. And we must remember the lessons that were learned so painfully over the centuries. If you go back to New York in 1900, a boy born in that city could expect to live 6 years less than a boy born in rural parts of America. That is the same gap in life expectancy that existed between Shakespeare's London and the rest of England. But civilization continued, urbanization continued, in part because cities made investments that made themselves safer. The great killers of 19th century urban America and urban Europe were yellow fever and cholera, plagues that came out of the tropics, were carried on by the globalization of their time, were carried on clipper ships across oceans, and came and struck down millions. Even before the waterborne nature of cholera was understood, a school of thought, the miasma theorists, who actually got the medicine wrong, started arguing for the need to make investments in sewers, in sanitation, in aqueducts, in the things, in fact, that the Romans knew you needed. I mean, after all, the Cloaca Maxima was created in Rome more than 2,500 years ago, and the aqueducts were the glory of the Roman world. To make those watery investments that will actually make the city less fetid. They didn't understand that cholera was waterborne, but they understood that the city needed to be more clean. And so by 1900, America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sanitation as our national government was spending on everything, except for the post office and the army. Now, it wasn't just about the spending on the aqueducts. It was also about regulations. It was also about rules. New York built its Croton Aqueduct in 1842, and for 25 years afterwards, the city continued to have cholera. My great-great-great-great-grandfather died in the cholera epidemic of 1849. It wasn't until you had the Board of Health start imposing rules, start imposing fines on tenement owners who didn't connect to the water system that the city became safe. Because until that point in time, poor people weren't paying for the connections, the landlords weren't paying for connections, and they continued to use their shallow wells, they continued to use their pit latrines, and they continued to die of cholera. These are things that we need to do going forward. We need to make whatever investments it takes to make sure that this never happens again, and to make sure that our world is more resilient against the inevitable plagues that we'll get through. At their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. And what we have gone through over the past 9 months is a remarkable de-urbanization of our world. Because in a sense, social distancing is the opposite of urbanity. It is distancing ourselves rather than bringing ourselves closer. Until our cities become safe, until we have a vaccine, until we put steps in place to make sure that this is not going to be the new normal, we will not get back to the urban world that so many of us love. One of the biggest challenges going forward is thinking about the public transit system. It's thinking about mobility. And there's a good reason why, in fact, one of the biggest shocks that happened over the past 8 months has been the incredible decline in the use of mass transit. Together with Stephen Redding and Caitlin Gorbach, we've done research on the use of public transit and mobility more generally using cell phone data inside New York. And we found that in the months of March and April, there's a very strong link between the number of trips taken and the amount of disease. In general, across areas, when the number of trips declined by 10%, the number of COVID cases declined by 20%. This doesn't mean that it was public transit itself that was causing the disease. We can't tell from that. But it does suggest why so many people view public transit with suspicion and fear right now. That is going to be an incredible challenge as we rebuild our world. Of course, this has not just been a public health disaster. It has also been an economic disaster. Together with a number of colleagues, we started doing surveys of American small businesses in April. In that month, 45% of the businesses in our sample were closed, and 35% of them expected that they would still be closed in December. Right? 1/5 of Americans, and I think more of Italians, work in occupations which hinge on face-to-face contact. 32 million Americans before the pandemic labored in retail trade, hospitality, and leisure. These sectors provided a safe haven from downsizing of factories, from automation, because people were willing to pay for a cappuccino if it was served with a smile. But when that smile turns into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure, those jobs can disappear in a heartbeat. And that's exactly what we have seen. We also face our urban world the threat that remote working is likely to become permanent. And indeed, this is one of the biggest changes that we've seen. Share of people going to their workplaces in Italy, at least as measured by the cell phone data had dropped 60% by April relative to the pre-pandemic period. In the United States, it was down about 40% at the same time period. And by May, 50 million Americans were working remotely. 50 million Americans had lost their jobs due to COVID-19. The question is this a temporary blip, or is this something that will become permanent? This is not the first time many of us have thought about these issues. The futurist Alvin Toffler, writing in 1980 in his book, The Third Wave, argued that the technology of his time, which I guess meant fax machines and telephones, were going to enable a vast increase in remote working. And he envisioned a world of electronic cottages and people just dialing it in. And for 40 years, he was wrong. And I certainly, this is one of the areas in which I worked. And generally, when you think about the interplay between technology and urbanization, there are some technologies which are centripetal, which pull us together, like the skyscraper, like the urban tram car, like the subway, like the sewer, like the aqueduct. And then there are some technologies that are centrifugal, that push us apart, like the automobile, like the television, like the radio, the technologies that enable us to do things from further distances. Well, Toffler had seen the deindustrialization of cities that had been made possible by transportation technologies. And he imagined that the same thing would happen to the idea-intensive industries that still stayed in cities. But he was wrong. He mistook what, for a centrifugal age, what turned out to be a great centripetal age from 1980 to 2019. When what happened due to globalization and new technologies was that there was a radical increase in the returns to being smart. And we are a social species that becomes smart by being around other smart people. We lived in an increasingly complex world, and the more complicated an idea is, the easier it is for that idea to get lost in translation. That's why until 2020, the smartest companies in the world didn't send everyone home and tell them all to dial it in. They bought the Googleplex. They moved to Milan. They located right next to each other, and they tried to get their workers to be as close to each other as possible, because they believed that all that personal connection would make for new idea creation. Then all of a sudden, that ended on a dime. Then all of a sudden, we're all zooming our way to work. Will this become permanent? So let me dust off my crystal ball and make some tentative predictions. I think the first point is that the remote working is unlikely to be nearly as permanent as people think it is. It's not a free lunch. For many people, it's extraordinarily difficult. Finding the space, getting the bandwidth to make this work is hard. And for many people, going to work was actually fun, right? And that's not going away. And particularly for younger workers, right? Many of them miss being in the office. Second point, the inequality of remote working is just staggering. So if we ask ourselves in the United States, what share of people with advanced degrees were remote working in May? The answer is 69%, right? Overwhelming majority. What share of Americans without a high school diploma were remote working? 5.2%. Those who have a high school degree but no college, 15%. So 15% or 5% versus 69%. An incredibly unequal world. And if this is the world that we imagine in our future, it's a world that is very unkind to less educated Italians, to less educated Americans. What do we know from surveys? Well, our small business owners, but 40% of them said that 40% or more of their workers who switched would stay switched. That's a pretty big number. That's a number of about 10 billion workers. We had another sample from the National Association of Business Economists, which was slightly smaller. 36% of businesses said that 40% or more of their workers who switched would stay switched. But of course, they are perhaps not anticipating what will happen in terms of housing costs, in terms of rents. They're not anticipating the fact that what happens with business owners is rather than letting those business spaces go empty, they will cut the rent substantially. And so I expect the actual switch will be much lower than this because of the accommodation through the price mechanism, because rents will drop. And so it'll become a lot more attractive to locate in a prime area and a lot cheaper. Final piece of information, final piece of data. This is from the work of Morales Aria and Daboin, who looked at jobs that could be done remotely and jobs that couldn't be done remotely. What they saw was that for jobs that couldn't be done remotely, they saw as soon as the plague hit, they saw both a substantial drop in employment and a substantial drop in postings for new hires, in job wanted ads on the largest of the American websites. When they turned to remotable jobs, the remotable employment was steady, but postings also dropped. Now move forward to today. What's happened? Well, non-remotable jobs, employment has mostly caught back, and postings have almost completely caught back. So the firms are still hiring for people to be gardeners or to do other jobs that involve not remote work, to work in factories. Remotable jobs, the employment stayed steady, but the new hires are completely down, which at least raises the possibility that I think many of us feel that it's possible to keep existing relationships going remotely, but it's much harder to initiate a new relationship. It's much harder to get someone invested in your company, invested in your school, invested in your subject. I think for myself, like many teachers, there's a deep frustration with the difficulties of trying to inspire students to care about cities or to care about economics, given that we can't connect with them in person. And I was just talking to one of my children yesterday who was saying how much more difficult it was to concentrate, particularly on difficult topics via Zoom. So, some final predictions. I think there are two branches in the tree going forward. So, if the vaccines don't work next year, if we get a second pandemic within the next 5 to 10 years, then our world will look very different and it will look substantially worse. The urban service industry that relies on face-to-face contact will be shattered, creating large-scale unemployment. There'll be enormous dislocations. But because of the cost of that, I anticipate that it won't happen. I anticipate that governments will, in fact, invest whatever they need to make sure that is not the way that our world goes. But even if the vaccines do work, even if things start getting back to normal by the middle of next year, the shock will still be real and it will still change urban life. What will those shifts look like? In the rich cities of the world, so in Milan, this means that prices will drop more than vacancies will rise. In places that were more in the margins, let's say cities in the Mezzogiorno, for example, you would expect there to actually be perhaps an increase in vacancies. Commercial space is likely to be more vulnerable than residential space. One thing that we've seen throughout the pandemic is that people can adjust who are able to do their work remotely, but it's much less fun. They miss the joy of being connected. And as soon as human beings are allowed to connect back with each other, to go to restaurants, to go to squares, to be together in person, they rush to do that. That suggests that the demand for urban life as a place of pleasure is likely to continue, and is likely, if anything, to be even more precious, because in some sense, we've all learned how much we can lose and how much we value being next to one another. Public transportation. Public transportation is an enormous challenge, and I think going forward, we have to recognize the need for flexibility, the possibility of how quickly we can make our buses or our trains more hygienic. I think that's absolutely crucial. I think we should expect some reallocation from cities being older to younger, both in terms of people and in terms of firms. The older, more vulnerable for the disease and perhaps less hungry for being in the midst of a maelstrom of human interaction. And I think consequently, we should expect to see more young people moving into these less expensive cities and perhaps turning them into more joyful places. We should expect the old enjoying more pleasures of the farm, the pleasures of the forest. There will be a continuing extreme importance of cities as places of pleasure, of what I've called consumer cities. And many of the cities I think that will do well out of this are cities that people really want to live in, which perhaps have had fewer businesses that you would imagine. Given that most of the world would like to live in Italy, this is likely to be an upside for Italy, as indeed I would expect some pressure from American technology workers who think that what they really want to do is live in Siena all their lives. But of course, for Italy as well, there will be suffering because international travel will surely be depressed for quite some time. So I don't, though, want an end on any sort of a dark note. It will be difficult. It is a challenge, but this is a tremendous opportunity for us to reboot our urban world, to put in place the health systems that we need to make sure that this never happens again, to make sure that we care for the most vulnerable, both in the rich world and in the poor world, because if anything, we have learned that a plague that starts anywhere can infect anyone. We are all in this planet, in it together. Right? And consequently, we cannot walk away from the poorest cities of the world, and we cannot try to isolate ourselves. There's no escape to a Tuscan villa from this plague. And going forward, right, we need to make sure, I think above all, that we cherish our human connections to each other, our friendships, and our ability to learn from one another. One of the things that I think is most striking in seeing which countries and which places got through it best, it wasn't necessarily the places that started with the most knowledge. It was the places that came with the most humility and recognized the need to learn on the ground. I think New Zealand, for example, was particularly striking in the importance they placed on measuring the extent of the disease, not just by measuring the symptomatic, but having regular surveys of the asymptomatic, which is how they learned when it was safe enough to open up again. So remembering the value of connection, of common space, of intellectual learning from each other, of humility. These are all the great virtues of the city. These virtues will come to the fore again, and the age of urban miracles is not over.